Good evening. It's so great to have all of you here. Tonight we're going to talk about the future of grizzly bears and wolves in Montana and further afield. I'd like to begin by doing a sort of informal survey. How many of you in this room, raise your hand, have seen a wolf in the wild? Great. How many of you have seen a grizzly bear in the wild? Let's reflect on that for a minute. That happens in only 3 states in the West, where 3 of the 48 states in the West that we can say we're able to do that. Those species don't exist in most of the lower 48, and what we have in our wild backyard is a miracle. I think it's really important that we think about why we're here tonight, what's lacking in other regions of the country, and the questions before us are, when we think about grizzly bear recovery and wolf reintroduction, those are considered 2 of the greatest wildlife conservation success stories in human history. And we've all been a part of them. We're living through it as engaged citizens and advocates for these species. You know, this is something that is kind of natural for us. When we have visitors from outside the region, they get a lot more uptight about things than we do. And we are proving that we can coexist with them. The question is, will the recovery of both species, the biological recovery, continue? And do we have the will to make it so? So tonight we're going to be hearing from 2 experts, 2 people I've known for a long time who are eminent in their field. If you think about people, some of us are of age. We came of age during the National Geographic specials on TV, if you remember those. Jane Goodall, the Craigheads, Diane Fossey, Jacques Cousteau. We have people tonight on the same stage who are comparable to that. Before I go any further, let's have a look at this map. It is by no means perfect, but this too should invite our reflection, because we are here tonight in the homeland of indigenous people and their tribes who have been on the land a long time, and they're still here with us. And there's a lot of lessons that we can learn about coexistence and longevity. And I think let's begin tonight by showing our respect and appreciation. Let's give them a hand of applause. I also want to thank our sponsors. My name is Todd Wilkinson. I've been a journalist based in Bozeman. I love coming to Missoula. It is, I think, the most lively environmental community in the state and in this part of the West. Our sponsors tonight are the Cinnabar Foundation, the Montana Wildlife Federation, which is based here, the National Parks Conservation Association. In Bozeman, one of the sponsors was the Gallatin Wildlife Federation and the Emerson Cultural Center. Let's hear it for our sponsors and also for the great folk at the Wilma. So how many of you know of this bear, have heard of a bear named Grizzly 399? Raise your hand. I'm sure all of you have heard what's happened today. Let me tell you a little bit about her. This photo was taken by my dear friend Tom Mengelson, a well-known Jackson Hole wildlife photographer. We collaborated on a couple of books about 399. This is $3.99 a couple of years ago when she famously, as a bear mother who was nearly a quarter century old, had 4 cubs. At 28, she was the oldest known mother in the lower 48 to have a cub. This year she had a cub nicknamed Spirit, best known living bear in the world. She had 18 cubs. Some of those cubs had cubs. 24 bears descended in her bloodline alone. And Dr. Servheen and I will talk more about her later. Yesterday, she was wandering in the Snake River Canyon south of Jackson, and she was hit and killed by a motorist. As of tonight, we don't know exactly what the fate of her cub Spirit is, but she's a bear that really allows us to sort of distill our thoughts about grizzlies, why individual bears matter, and this huge command of attention that they have. The whole world is thinking about her, those people who are familiar with her. And so we're going to talk about why grizzly bears and why wolves matter. It's my honor tonight to introduce Chris Servheen and Doug Smith. For 35 years, Dr. Servheen led grizzly bear recovery for the federal government. He was in charge of marshaling the agencies and winning public support, as well as the support of the states, to recover grizzly bears. He'll talk tonight about how few in number they were. Dr. Servheen is known globally as a bear expert, is an advisor on some rewilding attempts around the world. He also is the volunteer president of the Montana Wildlife Federation, and he lives in Missoula. It's a great pleasure to have him here tonight. Another man, Dr. Doug Smith, for a quarter century led wolf recovery in Yellowstone National Park. As many of you know, the most famous place to watch wild wolves is in the Lamar Valley of Yellowstone. Both of these guys have been on the front lines. Doug is also, I need to mention, he is an avian expert and has looked after conservation of birds in Yellowstone National Park. He is a speaker on the National Geographic circuit. And tonight, both of these guys have been in the front lines and the trenches of the public discussion involving both of these species. So what we're going to do tonight is they're going to come up and give some presentations, and then we're going to have a conversation, and I will also walk out and field some of your questions too. And if you're watching on Facebook, we welcome you as well. Leave your comments, and we'd love to know from different parts of the country and the world that you're watching. So welcome tonight, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Servheen. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's good to see such a nice audience here tonight. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the issues related to grizzly bears and grizzly bears, their future in Montana. There we go. This is the historic range of grizzly bears there. They used to occur all the way down into central Mexico. The dark red area is the current range of grizzly bears. The map on the right is the estimated range in 1922, and you could see that by 1922 there were still grizzly bears in many areas of the Rocky Mountains, even down into Arizona and New Mexico. And 1922 is an important year because that was the I'm giving a signal back here to, there we go. That was the last year there was a wild grizzly bear in the state of California, 1922. So they put grizzly bears on the state flag, and then they proceed to kill every last one of them. So the grizzly bear was listed under the Endangered Species Act as a threatened species in 1975. Recovery efforts began in 1981. I'm giving Kyle some comments because this is giving me some trouble. This was the expected range or where people thought grizzly bears were in 1975 when they were listed. But since that time, we found that there were really no grizzly bears in the Bitterroot. They were probably gone in the 1950s. And then the North Cascades, there were probably 1 or 2 bears right along the border. And those bears are gone now. So those 2 ecosystems really didn't have grizzly bear populations in them in 1975. So we had these 4 other areas where grizzly bears were. So we started the recovery program in 1980, 1981, and there were about 400 grizzly bears south of Canada at that point. And today there's more than 2,000 grizzly bears across the 4 ecosystems of Yellowstone, the Northern Continental Divide, the Cabinet Yaak, and the Selkirk ecosystems. And we see today the distribution of grizzly bears. The reddish colors you see on this map are the current distribution of grizzly bears in the Rockies. And the Northern Continental Divide population is about 60 miles from the Yellowstone population. But you can see that grizzly bears exist in many areas outside those recovery zones where they were in 1975. And in 1980, there were hardly any bears outside these yellow lines that you see here. So some evidence of recovery. We've seen several female grizzlies den on the Montana prairie and produce cubs. And this particular den was 25 miles from the mountains. It's probably 5 miles to the nearest tree from where this den was excavated. And you can see the excavated dirt there. The den entrance is right there. And this is certainly evidence of recovery because grizzly bears haven't denned on the Montana prairie in over 100 years, since the 1800s. And seeing them out in places like this is pretty amazing. You can see the mountains there in the distance are 25 miles away. So here's the den site right there. Oop, there's the den site right there. And the only way you can find this kind of a den is that female was wearing a radio collar. Okay, so landscape connectivity is important to grizzly bear recovery. And as you see here, we're starting to see connectivity across the landscape. And in fact, those 4 separate populations that existed in 1975 as separate entities are starting to merge together. And what we're seeing is a big population that is starting to exist here in the Northern Rockies, where they start to move between ecosystems. This makes those populations more resilient to all the activities that go on across the landscape, more resilient to climate change, and healthier in the long run if we treat them as one big unit. And this is called a metapopulation, where you see different units, islands, that are starting to reconnect with each other. However, there are increasing threats to grizzly bears. These are some good things that are happening right now, but recovery is more than just numbers of bears. So as I said, there's about 2,000 bears south of Canada right now in those 4 populations, but recovery is not measured by just the number of bears. The Endangered Species Act says that we need adequate regulatory mechanisms in place, particularly for mortality, so that when the ESA is pulled out from underneath those bears, that they remain healthy. And so the grizzly bear deaths do not go up as soon as the ESA no longer protects them. what we're seeing, unfortunately, is political backlash due to anti-predator hysteria in state legislatures. And this threatens the probability of ever recovering and delisting grizzly bears. The focus of some agencies has changed from recovering grizzly bears to delisting grizzly bears. Oh, I gotta go back. Delisting takes the focus off real recovery and is pushed for political expediency, not to benefit grizzly bears. So recovery and delisting are two different things. Delisting does not mean driving the populations down to minimum numbers, as we're seeing happen with wolves now. Delisting does not mean reducing numbers and range immediately upon delisting. Does not mean minimal conflict reduction efforts outside recovery zones. And it does not mean allowing new killing mechanisms on the landscape that will result in dead bears. Grizzlies are still at risk because of state legislatures. And I hate to say it, but it's sad that the greatest threats to grizzly bears today are state politicians. They're passing legislation and implementing harmful anti-carnivore policies that demonize predators. These include hound hunting of black bears where grizzly bears are present, wolf traps and snares with bait where grizzly bears are present, paying people bounties to kill wolves, that's unethical, that's right out of the 1800s. Shooting wolves over bait at night with spotlights, that's not fair chase hunting, and it's unethical. And the general idea of demonizing predators to justify these unnecessary ways to kill animals on the landscape. These animals don't need to be demonized. They are not demons, they are native species who live here. So, wolf trapping and snaring in grizzly range, and if we could back up a little bit there, Kyle, there we go, results in dead and injured grizzly bears. So here's a wolf snare around a grizzly bear's neck. This bear chewed the snare off and left with that snare around his neck. Here's a grizzly bear in a wolf trap. Here's a trap with 2 grizzly bear claws in it. Those claws eventually rotted off after the bear carried that trap around for a long, long time. And this is a scar from a snare around the neck of a grizzly bear. Aldo Leopold said, ethical behavior is doing the right thing when no one else is watching, even when doing the wrong thing is legal. Black bear hunting with hounds is going to result in dead grizzly bears. Here's a newspaper article out of British Columbia, just north of the US border here, where 2 guys were trapping black bears with dogs, and they were attacked by a grizzly bear when the dog got tangled up with the grizzly bear. The man was unfortunately severely mauled, and the grizzly bear was killed. Montana and Idaho currently allow hound hunting of black bears where grizzly bears are present. In 2024, Montana allowed, again, black bear hunting where grizzly bears were present. And these, on this map, these light areas are where hound hunting is allowed, and the cross-hatching is in the Fish and Game regulations. It says grizzly bears are found in those areas. So they're putting black bear hound hunters right on top of grizzly bears. And this is being done while grizzly bears are still listed under the Endangered Species Act. One can only imagine what Montana hound hunting regulations would look like if grizzly bears were ever delisted. This is really unnecessary. Why so anti-carnivore? I'm going to back up. There we go. This seems to be based on an abnormal hatred of carnivores that is not reasonable. And it's not based on facts. It is basically the anti-predator attitudes of the 1800s coming into the 2020s. Why? The state policy toward carnivores have no place in modern-day science and fact-based wildlife management. If we are to maintain healthy wolf and grizzly populations in the future, we must manage them using science and facts applied in a professional manner and refined through a balanced and fair public process. That paragraph is taken out of an article that Doug Smith and I wrote for Yellowstonian early this year. The states, as Todd said, where we still have grizzly bears and wolves should be proud of being some of the few places where these animals remain in the lower 48 states. Instead, some influential politicians in these states see grizzlies and wolves as a burden and an inconvenience. The states should be proud to be some of the few places left where these magnificent animals still roam. This is a wild grizzly bear from Montana. They're still out there. We should be proud that they're out there and look into the mountains and think of the wonders of the fact that we live in the same place as animals like this. They're not a burden. They're not an inconvenience. They are a responsibility. There are other threats to grizzly bears. Increasing recreation and land development also threatens grizzly bears. This is a graphic from Headwaters Economics, and every one of those red dots is a house. And you can see the year at the top here, and you can see the increasing numbers of houses and development across the landscape in Montana. There are many more people here today in Montana than when we started the recovery program. And all these people put grizzly bears and many other wildlife like elk at risk. Oop, I gotta go back here. We go back there, Kyle. Go back again. Yeah, that one. Let's just leave it there for a moment.
I want to jump in here as a journalist. One of the things I write a lot about are growth issues. One of the things we're not talking about with the Endangered Species Act and recovery is the role of private lands. In Greater Yellowstone, about 24 million acres. About a quarter of that, 6 million acres, is private land. Think of the mountain valleys, think of the Bitterroot Valley, think of the valleys spiraling out of Missoula, think of the Flathead Valley. All of those valleys are crucial connective tissue for all of the wildlife that we have. In Greater Yellowstone, we have all of the species that were there in 1491. We brought them back. And so the great elephant in the room is what's happening in our valleys. How are the animals going to move between the mountains? 80% of the species in Greater Yellowstone spend time on private ground. And so you look at this. This is a time progression that takes us up to 2021, right in the middle of COVID. How many of you have been to Bozeman, Montana? How many of you are shocked every time you drive in there? So Bozeman, Montana, at a modest 3% growth rate, would double in size every 24 years, but it's actually growing at 4 to 5%, which means it will double every 18 years, and this was calculated in 2017 before COVID. Since COVID, everything has accelerated. Not only permanent residents pouring into the Gallatin Valley, but second homeowners who move there. In fact, in Park County, Livingston, Paradise Valley, the number of homeowners, second homeowners, is greater than the population growth there. And so at that 3 or 4% growth rate, in 18 years, the Gallatin Valley will be Salt Lake City proper sized, going from 110, 120,000 to almost 250,000 people. Salt Lake City proper, not the entire Wasatch. And if it doubles again, It will be Minneapolis proper sized in 2065. Nobody disputes this. And since COVID, nobody argues with that growth rate. So the point here is, one of Chris's colleagues, Dr. Chuck Schwartz, who headed the Yellowstone Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team, did an analysis along with others, and they found that a grizzly bear will exhibit aversive behavior if you have just one home and a cluster of dwellings on one section of land. And so you look at this. This is all accelerated in the last 3 years. What's good for grizzly bears is good for 220 other species. So if we're really going to be thinking about recovery here, what are we going to do about this filling in with the valleys? The only way that we're going to protect not only grizzly bears but wildlife is to give them space. When Dr. Smith comes up here in a minute, you're going to see, remember this, because he's going to project a slide that shows you roads and trails. So try to think of what it's like to go through a landscape as a grizzly bear.
There is a disconnect between human population growth, suburban sprawl, and the ability of wildlife to adapt to this changing environment. Land development decisions should consider the impacts of such development on valuable animals like grizzly bears. Those land development decisions are made by each county, and in many cases the counties don't have the tools to make those kinds of good decisions. And look at these growth rates here. These are growth since 2010. Gallatin County is 42.7% growth rate since 2010. And while it may be funny sometimes to talk about Bozeman as Bose Angeles, it's not going to be funny if it starts to look like Salt Lake City. And it's going to be real difficult for us to keep the animals that live around there healthy. Back up there. Okay. Suburban sprawl is the leading bleeding edge of grizzly bear management and survival as humans and bears move into each other's habitat. Increasing recreation is also an issue. All these people moving in want to recreate. They want to go to public lands and recreate, and agencies have a lot of recreation demand. They often ignore the impacts of all this recreation on wildlife when they make their decisions. For example, recreation drives grizzly bears off alpine moth feeding areas. There's a grizzly bear right there. The management of recreation is important in important grizzly bear habitats. And if we're going to manage grizzly bears successfully, we have to identify where these important habitats are and manage recreation in those places so the bears can use them. In summary, recovery has been a success story, but now it's at risk due to politics and land use pressures. Bears have come a long way in 40 years, from 400 or so bears to more than 2,000 today. We don't want to go backwards. Thank you for listening. One more advance there, Kyle. There you go. That's it. You have to advance it for you. Keep watching there.
Okay, tough act to follow, Todd and Chris, and I'll do my best. But my name is Doug Smith, and I'm going to talk more about wolves, but also wolves and grizzly bears to kind of mend our two talks together. And there are a lot of similarities between wolves and grizzly bears in that they're both two iconic large carnivores in North America that were fundamentally eradicated from a good portion of the United States and North America. At least that was the goal. And so my summary of wolves is going to be more general than specific compared to Chris's summary of grizzly bear eradication. But wolves had an extraordinarily wide distribution across North America, and where there weren't gray wolves, there were red wolves. So in a lot of ways, they were the dominant primary predator for structuring North American ecosystems. And like grizzly bears, it was kind of the goal of European settlement to eliminate these predators. And with all due respect to grizzly bears and Chris, et cetera, wolves held a special place in predator eradication. They were kind of the antithesis of civilization, to be honest, in conquering the North American continent. So this began to be recognized and wolves were largely gone from the lower 48 by the 1920s and 1930s. The only surviving population was in northern Minnesota. There was a small population in the Arrowhead region, which is up by Lake Superior, and a few hundred wolves survived there. Every other place, wolves were wiped out. So the photo I have here is from the first monograph ever written on wolves. It's Adolph Murray's The Wolves of Mount McKinley, and this is the frontispiece to that book, monograph. And it's a quote of Robert Service at the bottom. "The mountains are part of me, and I am fellow to the trees." And that I would like to make the beginning of my talk, because this, I think, represents not only wolves, if we could go back. Yeah, this represents not only wolves, it is symbolic of kind of a cultural touchstone for wildness. And this, I was a young person when I opened to this page in this book and read this, and then went on to read the rest of the book. And Adolph Murray was very big in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. I met his wife, Wheezy Murray, and so those eyes, to me, he knew early what those eyes meant. And so I dashed off some thoughts that I reminisced from when I first came onto this, and the importance of what I thought this represented and what wolves represented. So I'm going to read it. This was the view I grew up with. I am ideologically predisposed to believe that wolves are symbols of wildness, pure and spiritual, and should be left alone, wherever they are, and their populations allowed to fluctuate as is where they can be. They carry much symbolic value as how the world should not be run and taken over by people. This viewpoint will no longer work nowadays. This viewpoint is over here, and the world is over here. And the purpose of our presentations this evening is to try and find a way forward. The disparity of what Chris and Todd just described as the value of large carnivores in untrammeled landscapes not dominated by people, and in all places, a place like Missoula, Montana, that this used to be the ethic advanced by wilderness visionaries like Adolph Murray here. And somehow we ended up there. And I'm still here, but the rest of the world isn't. So the whole point of at least my portion of the talk tonight is to try and get here, somewhere in the middle, so we can incrementally move to where I believe we should be, as Chris just described. And this is very, very hard for me to do. And I say this because after 28 years in government service, it's harder to be at the forefront of some of these things. And since I retired now, I'm talking to a wider variety of people without permission in more walks of life. And I have found that if you can look them in the eye and be reasonable and offer moderate positions of compromise, you can get your way a little bit down the road. And this is very, very hard for me because I think we should be here, but we cannot get there in one step. So the rest of my talk will be some explicit examples of what I'm talking about. But because I'm speaking second, I want to say a couple things about the difference between grizzly bears and wolves. This is a photo I took on a flight in Yellowstone, grizzly bear, wolf, and it's not a common sight. The two often don't get this close. I'm not going to say they're intolerant of each other. There's just kind of a give and take that they give each other space. Wolf usually makes the kill. Grizzly bear usually takes it. They win about 80% of the time. But this is one of the few photos that I had that was handy, showing these two iconic carnivores right next to each other. And it also highlights a couple key differences. Wolves are very, very social. They're one of the most social large carnivores in the world, especially North America. And so everything that they do in our management of them deals with their sociality. They want to be with other wolves. They live in family groups. Bears are completely different. Chris corrected me on a couple of my errors the other night. We did this talk Friday night in Bozeman. I strongly identified with bears as being solitary. Females with cubs aren't. They have cultural traditions, but they're not as social and live in family groups as wolves. So those are fundamentally very different things. So here, wolves social, very high productivity. They begin breeding at young ages. They breed every year. They have large litters. Some packs in some conditions, I won't get into the details of this, can have more than one litter per pack. Almost exclusively meat eaters, and they can occur at much higher densities than you probably will find grizzly bears. Grizzly bears in general, the exception is sows with cubs, solitary, very low productivity. They don't breed every year. They have delayed maturation. They don't, wolves can start breeding at 20 months. Bears, nothing like that. They eat everything, but mostly vegetation. I realize they do eat meat at certain times of the year, especially, calves and fawns, and usually much lower density. So these two iconic kind of Montana-defining carnivores have evolved to be very different things. Wolves, essentially, and it's always good to come up with quick ways to remember things that it sticks with you. Live life in a hurry, And most wolves in Yellowstone die at 5 to 6 years of age. They can live longer, 10, 12. We had one live to 13. But they're usually dying 5, 6. Very different life history approach. 399 was 28. That's unheard of for a wolf. Cougars live past 20. So these large carnivores in North America have very different approaches to life. Wolves are an outlier. And we have abused that, and we continue to do it. And when you make a mistake with an animal that's highly productive, it's forgiving. When you make a mistake with an animal like this, the mistake lasts for years. Those are very important differences. So here, the last slide was the biology and ecology. This is the human response to that ecology. Oops, wrong slide. I'm ahead of myself, sorry. There it is. Yeah, that's the slide I was looking for. I've lost track of my slides. High harvest. They bounce back right away because of these early breeding, large litters, more than one female breeding in a pack. This is a pervasive thought in the wolf management literature. To have them, you got to kill them. In other words, when they kill livestock, kill them quick. And people during hunting season for elk and deer, if they can't shoot a wolf or two, they don't want them on the landscape. Killing to gain social acceptance. No need for precise population estimates. Why do you need a precise population estimate when they're so elastic in their population response? Liberal regulations. Every place wolves weren't eliminated, Canada and Alaska, super liberal, high quotas, long seasons, many different methods to kill them. Bears, the exact opposite. Limited heart. I mean, you kill a couple females and it changes the whole population trajectory. Mistakes last. Bounce back, not like wolves. Killing for acceptance, they might have that in common. Everybody feels better with a little bit of blood in the ground, seems like. Very precise population estimate. Lots of work goes in to pinpointing how many bears there are. Very restrictive regulations. These management approaches reflect the biology. Chris focused on grizzly bears, and I'm focusing on wolves. This is just, thumb in the air, dead reckoning. They'll bounce back. They'll be fine. That's a refrain often heard in wolf management. Okay, so here's Montana. I have the approximate 1,100. Again, you don't need a precise estimate to determine the number of wolves. I'll get to that in a minute, how wolves are estimated in Montana. It's an approximate estimation. I put this in red. This is the number of wolves that died. This is due to trapping and hunting. This is due to livestock control. That equals 317. That's 29% of 1,100. That's considered a sustainable offtake for wolves North America-wide. Kill 30% and your population will remain stable. Give or take. There's some debate about this in the literature. It can be lower, but this is a generally accepted number. A lot of managers are like, we're right in line with what we should be. However, this number is a very rough estimate. So you can't estimate this number unless you got a good estimate on that. But there's no incentive to make this a specific number because the final rule for wolves by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service when wolves are delisted in Montana, 2009 for the first time. They were relisted and delisted a couple different times. Only requires there be 100 wolves in the state of Montana. And they're managing for 150 to give a 50 wolf buffer. So why do you need a precise estimate if you only need 150? You're way over, but this, if you're trying to talk about harvest and management, that affects this. You also have a hunting season that starts September 15th that goes to March 15th. Pelts on a wolf are probably not prime until the earliest, late October, early November. This is always, across the north, wolves are considered a valuable natural resource when they have a full pelt. Why would you begin a hunting season a full 2 months before they can be used as a valuable, cherished natural resource? Why we harvest wildlife. Hardly any livestock are killed. That was one of the primary reasons of opposing wolves. They're going to do in the livestock industry. I think we can dispense with that. That's a longer discussion than we have time for. That the ranchers are compensated. Lots of cattle and sheep in Montana. The industry is not impacted, is my point. Elk population now is larger than it was in 1995. That was the second and more stickier reason to not have wolves. Everyone knew wolves are going to eat elk and deer. And so they're going to wipe out hunting as we know it. Elk populations have increased since 1995. So, and that's with grizzly bears, black bears, cougars, also as large carnivores in Montana. The elk harvest now is also higher than it was. This was a vocal and fierce opposition to wolf recovery. So these are some of the basics that we would like to display in terms of management. And this is just people remember pictures better than words. So this is Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, elk population 95, a few years ago, higher. Montana, elk, a few years ago, higher than when wolves were introduced, higher. And this is harvest rate, no data here, either unaffected or higher. So again, Chris spoke to the value, it may come up in the discussion, the value of science-based decision-making, foundational facts for decision-making. These are key. So again, trying to give you a mental break, photograph took flying over a pack of wolves that killed an elk. This is a strong opposition to having wolves, or to have these high harvest, liberal harvest rates with wolves. I think the data are indicating there's more elk, higher harvest rates than when wolves were introduced. So that right now, at least for the time being, is a mute argument. Okay, was there another slide there? Yeah, and so another key point is almost every state in the country bases their wildlife management on what's called the North American model of wildlife management. It's a cherished and honored policy for managing wildlife. There are some issues with it. It tends to favor game animals and not endangered species, or carnivores. University of Montana, there's a lot of great thinkers at the University of Montana. Some of them have brought this up. And these are the 7 tenets. And I'm going a little long here, so I got to pick up the pace. Wildlife, public trust, prohibition of commerce, rule of law, opportunity for all, killed for legitimate purpose, fair chase, no waste. What are you killing a wolf for in September? Its pelt is not valuable. This is one of the tenets of what all the states apply to in terms of wildlife management. International resource, best available science. Chris spoke to that. We'll get to that more in the question and answer period. More and more decisions are being made by the Montana legislature instead of the Fish and Game Commissioners or biologists working for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. So 2 of the 7 tenets seem to be on shaky ground or thin ice. And so this is legal in Montana. It's called whacking. They do it more to coyotes, but they do it to wolves. It was an international sensation in Daniel, Wyoming this last February. It essentially is spotting a canid, fox, coyote, wolf on a snow machine and running it down. Or a four-wheeler if there's no snow, pinning it down with the tires. And in this particular case, you've read all about it, it was everywhere. Not killing it, but taping its mouth and taking it to into a tavern for personal pleasure and enjoyment. I started off my talk saying, I'm trying to impact change by being moderate, going against my Adolph Murray-inspired upbringing and being a middle-of-the-roader. I can't believe this is legal in the state of Montana, Wyoming, or Idaho. And I'm a hunter, that you can run down an animal and run it over multiple times with a snow machine or an ATV, and these kinds of things come up in legislature and don't even make it out of committee. So I don't know what to tell you guys tonight, but vote your conscience. And tell all your friends to vote your conscience too, because I'm a moderate. I'm going against my instincts telling you to believe in that frontispiece to Adolph Murray's book, Wolves of Mount McKinley's, the trees are a part of me, I am fellow to the, I forget the exact quote. This is not right. Neither are predator killing contests. Going out and shooting foxes, coyotes, and wolves for pleasure and competition on public land. Again, I'm a moderate guy. That ain't moderate. Ethical? Humane? People are starting to debate the meaning of the word humane. It's kind of like that Supreme Court judge. I don't know the definition of sex, but I know when I see it. This is that. Yet we can't do anything about it. We should be angry about this. We should be angry about this. This is Shoshone National Forest, Wyoming. What kind of message does this send? White masks, guns, dead wolf, American flag. I consider myself a patriotic American. That ain't me. That's not me. So here are some key issues. Who's making the decisions? Is wildlife biology becoming political or run by biologists? This fair chase hunting, predator killing contests, snowmobile ATV torture, night hunting, baiting. Chris laid out the dog issue. The count that is used for Montana was designed to be a distribution estimator, not an estimator for abundance. This is beyond the scope of the talk, but integrated patch occupancy models designed to assess distribution on abundance. It can be used if you use a capture-recapture methodology using genetics like they do in Italy, but they're not doing that. So this is just a back-of-the-envelope estimate. But of course, the final rule doesn't force you to have a specific. So this is a systemic structural error. I'm part of this. I have to take some of the fault for this. I reviewed the final rule. So I put this up here. Again, it's a rush to the end. But zonal management means you have some places where you manage in favor of carnivores. They're doing this some places in the Midwest. They could self-select the places of low conflict, high public land, wilderness areas, not just national parks easy. You actually manage in favor of carnivores instead of just having kind of a statewide approach. And of course, wolves could be used. This is unknown, the science. A couple of you talked about it with me before the talk. The science is weak, but there does seem to be some correlational data that indicate where CWD is high, wolf numbers are low and vice versa. Why not experiment with that to see if wolves could be used as a culling purpose? And so, here's the things that I'm frustrated with is just recently, these are the hunt units outside Yellowstone. We got them split to geographically constrain harvest, which could reduce impacts of human-caused mortality on one pack. It's the same number of wolves killed, but it's separated by geography, which would lessen the impacts of human-caused mortality. This is a teeny win, teeny, but it's a win. And the Fish FWB Commission just passed this by unanimous vote. It was legal to hunt wolves with telemetry, use radio collars to hunt. I can't believe that's up there with running them over with snowmobiles, personally. But it was legal. So that was eliminated by the FWB Commission. These are small wins. That's great. That's great. They're small. But we need to improve on it. Why do you live close to Glacier, closer than me in Bozeman? Well, this is a reduced quote outside Yellowstone. Why isn't there one outside of Glacier? There wasn't a strong feeling for that. Whacking, I already talked about it. Night hunting, I already talked about it. Baiting, dogs, and bounties. This is generally a thinly veiled thing for having bounties. This we got. This is what we need to start working on. Chipping away at to go from here to there. I'm not trying to be a radical. I know this is Missoula. All you guys are radicals. I'm trying to get to the middle. Middle. These are modest. These are modest. I'm almost done. I don't know why the slide's not showing. Oh, there. Okay, next slide. I think this is the last slide. If it's not, I'll make it the last slide. This is hard talk to give. I'm an ex-government bureaucrat. I'm standing up here criticizing government management. Speaking idealistically, you know, maybe it's pent up energy I've had all these years. But really, what is this all about? This is the best I can do to characterize it. Decisions based on data and science. I'm fine if the decisions don't come out the way I think they should come out. Heck, nobody in the world lives over here with me, but let's at least use the data and science to have a discussion and then have a societal debate on what we're going to do. That's not occurring. It's occurring, it's just what my values are, we're going to legislate that. That's what's happening now. All voices are included, trust in all. I think you know what that means. You know, someone making phone calls, the buddies, the good old boy system, communities like in this room, voices are not heard. That's my main message for the talk. You need to have your voices heard. I've talked to some of these people making decisions, and they say things like, we don't hear about that. And then perhaps the most important, and Chris and Todd eloquently touched on it. Why do we live here? Why not live someplace else? Because we have grizzly bears, wolves, black bears, cougars, coyotes, lynx, bobcat, wolverines, those kind, plus the big game that we hunt and love to hunt, that coexist with the large carnivores. These are the things we need to work on moving forward. Thank you very much.
We're going to spend about 15 minutes. I'm going to ask some questions, and then we're going to bring those questions out to you. So be thinking about what you want to pose, the questions you want to pose to these guys. The first question that I want to begin with is one that's directed at both of them regarding both species. We hear a lot about numbers. We hear a lot about thresholds for removing them. We hear a lot about surplus animals to allegedly justify hunting. What I want to start with, and Chris and Doug, is could you explain for all of us what's the difference between political delisting and biological recovery, and why does knowing the difference between those two matter if we want to perpetuate these animals going forward?
Well, biological recovery to me is when the animals are distributed across the landscape in all the places they can live, and they are at sufficient numbers to have resiliency and redundancy so that when things happen, like increasing numbers of people on the landscape or disease or climate change, that there's still some level of confidence that those animals are going to be there in the long term. That's biological recovery to me. Political delisting is when people just rely on numbers, and then you have politicians introducing bills in Congress to delist grizzly bears based on numbers of bears, and that's not biological recovery, that's political delisting.
Yeah, I don't think there's much to add to that. You know, and Chris knows the Endangered Species Act better than I do. He worked Fish and Wildlife Service, I was in the Park Service. But, you know, the recovery plan for wolves set as a minimum population 3 times 100, 100 in each state of Idaho, Montana, Wyoming. And each state is managing for a buffer of about 50, so that's 3 times 150 or 450. And so that's the minimum population size needed to trigger delisting. And then the second criteria is adequate regulatory mechanism, which is, you know, the states have regulations in place to prevent the population becoming endangered again. And those are really the only 2 things you need to delist. But as Chris just said, that might not necessarily mean biological recovery. I'll just point out that, you know, there are more black bears and cougars than wolves in Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, yet there's very close attention paid to how many wolves there are, even though you only need to have that many in place. And all the regulations I just showed you on the screen were enacted in 2020, and the Fish and Wildlife Service response to that was to initiate a status review. And what status review is the federal government taking a look to see if wolves need to be relisted. And they did that because of all those new regulations going in 2020. We refer to that as a shot across the bow. It took a while, but it was determined that they did not need to be relisted. But it was in response to the regulations that were put in place. And that is all decisions relative to delisting and relisting, not biological recovery, which some scientists believe is 800 to 1,200 wolves in the region. Now we're above that. And so they say, what's the point? And that is a good argument, but nonetheless, regulation-wise, they could manage to 300. And so those things are disparate or not well connected, is what I'll add to Chris's answer.
Thank you for that. One thing that I think is important for you all to consider is that Chris was the National Recovery Coordinator for Grizzlies for 3.5 decades. And during that time, you were a strong booster for delisting, removing bears from federal protection, handing management over to the states. Your name ended up on a bunch of lawsuits filed by environmentalists against you and the service. Ultimately, delisting moved forward only to be overturned twice. Today, you are opposed to delisting. Could you elaborate a bit on the reasons why you're opposed, and also taking into account the snowmobile incident in which the wolves were run down and the policy implications of that? Could you elaborate a little bit on how and why you changed your position?
Well, I am opposed to delisting now, basically because biological decisions are now being made by politicians. And for 30 years, I had great confidence in the state fish and game biologists in all the states who were professionals and who made decisions based on science and facts. And recently, about 2020 or even a little before that, we started to see the politicians in the states suppressing the biologists and beginning to make biological decisions on their own as to how many wolves we should have and new methods to kill them, where those methods to kill them should be. And when politicians make biological decisions, bad things happen. And so, you know, it's really unfortunate, but the reason I changed my mind is that the state biologists are no longer making the decisions. The politicians are, and they've given us every evidence of a lack of trust in what they have no interest in these animals. They have an interest in a political success, which to them is delisting and claiming victory over the oppressive yoke of the Fish and Wildlife Service. So I changed my mind.
Just a quick follow-up, Chris. When you saw the refusal of the state of Wyoming to take action in outlawing the running down of wolves and other animals with snowmobiles, literally being allowed to kill them with the machines, how does that set a context for the way that you think about state management there of grizzly bears?
Well, it's appalling. It's a new level of depravity to legalize that kind of thing. And I'll remind you that that is legal in the state of Montana, it's legal in the state of Idaho, and it's legal in the state of Wyoming. And when there have been bills introduced in the Montana legislature to make it illegal to kill animals with snow machines, they never made it out of committee. And when this committee was tasked with fixing the issue in Wyoming that Doug so eloquently described, where this guy brought a living wolf in and displayed it in a bar after running it down with a snow machine, What their end decision was is that they legalized the ability for people to run wolves down with snow machines. And remember, these are not wolves that have committed any act. They've not been depredating on anything. They're just running around, living alive on their own, and it's okay to run them down with a snow machine. And that is appalling, and that is not something that a civilized society should be very satisfied with.
Doug, in the last couple of years of your tenure in Yellowstone, you've had an esteemed career. You've studied under some of the foremost wolf biologists in the world, and you were able to witness this quota system that was politically set north of Yellowstone in Montana. 19 wolves were killed. Could you discuss a bit what impact that had biologically on different packs, what happened, and also as a biologist who cares about the animals one studies, how did that make you feel?
Well, I think to add a little context to that, you know, I took my job as a National Park Service employee very seriously. Our job was to, you know, the Park Service mission can be boiled down to two simple things: preservation, or preserving natural systems, and visitor enjoyment. There's a lot written about that, and they kind of oppose each other, but I took it seriously, and my job, part of it happened to be wolves. And, you know, so we looked into, you know, boundary management, because it's well known Yellowstone National Park is created imperfectly. It was created for geysers. It's not created for wildlife movement or migration, and the animals don't know where the line is. And it's difficult for an animal to go from complete protection to no protection over an invisible line. And so our working with the state, which has different management objectives, which can be summarized as conservation, which is equally worthy, which means wise use instead of no use. Preservation is defined as no use. Both worthy, just different, but the animals don't know that transition. And so our long-term objective was to make that line a soft boundary, not a hard boundary. And we had done that. It was working. And then in 2020, all the regulations got changed, and the soft boundary, the regulations, which was a quota system that I was in a hurry to finish my talk, I went over, I'm sorry for that, but the quota system was put in place. That was wiped out in 2020. So the 21-22 winter, we went from having 2 to 3 wolves killed on average, occasionally 4, along the Yellowstone-Montana boundary, to 19. 25 park-wide, because Idaho and Wyoming killed some. That was 20% of the Yellowstone Park population. That's a harvest rate on a national park. And so, as I mentioned, biologically, the blowback that we got, lots of blowback, and I wanted to write letters opposing it. I wrote them and they weren't approved, but was the wolves will deal with it. That's well below that 30% mark. So reproductively, they can bounce back, and they can. And if you watched, we had some compensatory reproduction in the next few years, i.e. they produce more pups. But to me, that's not natural. That's not a natural system. Our job is to allow natural processes to occur. That was my job, whether I liked it or not. And when you get a 20% harvest rate, yes, they'll bounce back biologically, and that was thrown in our face, because the population counts the next few years after that harvest rate were up, because they cranked up to deal with the mortality by having more pups. But again, that's not natural. And then the thing that isn't studied very much, everybody studies wolf population dynamics. Very few study wolf social dynamics. And what was happening is how those packs resorted, and mortality actually went up, natural mortality, after wolves were killed, because they started to trespassed in different territories. And so the packs fought with each other more and killed wolves that probably wouldn't have been killed. In one case, a lead female that used to be called an alpha female was killed outside the park, and that pack went places they had never been before and ran afoul of other packs. My point is none of that is natural. And so this is important to how we're doing our job. And everyone's like, the population's fine. The population's fine. That's not the National Park Service mission. That wasn't our job. That's why working these things out that we had worked out along the boundary are important. And it was a political change that did that. And so that's why me, who doesn't like getting up and grandstanding like this, agreed to do stuff like this. We want to change that kind of approach.
There's a lot of policy made upon conjecture, and journalists, we try to fact check and look at the science. Chris, I want to ask you a question. One of the assertions is that grizzly bears need, quote, management, that they're not being managed. And along with that is an assertion that hunting will reduce conflicts and it will reduce risk of human fatalities. Could you share your thoughts on that?
Okay, it's a really good question. Many people think that hunting will reduce human-bear conflicts. There is no science that shows that hunting reduces human-bear conflicts. In fact, there's a lot of science that shows that excessive hunting mortality doesn't change conflict levels at all. The main driver of human-bear conflicts is food levels, natural foods. And when natural foods are low, the bears come close to people and they get into trouble. And when you have a hunting season, you're not hunting around somebody's house or around somebody's barn. And so hunting will not reduce human-bear conflicts. The only way it would do that is if you killed all the bears. But a sustainable hunt will not reduce human-bear conflicts. And as far as human fatalities go, it will not reduce the number of human fatalities due to bears, because most human fatalities related to bears are due to surprise encounters, where people come up close to a bear. They may surprise the bear at close range. It may be a female with cubs. It may be an adult. They may get close to a bear that is on a carcass, and that bear is defending that carcass. Those people are injured and sometimes, unfortunately, killed. But hunting bears is not going to change that at all, because the hunter that takes bears is not going to be taking the bear that might be surprised by a hunter because he turned left instead of going right. So there's no relationship between hunting and the reduction in human fatalities due to bears, and there's no relationship between hunting and human-bear conflicts.
Doug, this is a two-parter. Tens of millions of people have come to Yellowstone National Park since wolf reintroduction. Lots of people moving through the backcountry. How many humans have been eaten in Yellowstone since 1995?
None.
Okay. There is an assertion, and we all heard this in the 1990s after wolf reintroduction. The assertions were made that wolves and grizzly bears would grow ad infinitum across the landscape, that there would be no stopping them. One of the gubernatorial candidates from Paradise Valley called wolf reintroduction the biggest ecological disaster in human history, and that there would be no animals, that first they would eat all the ungulates, and then they would turn onto livestock and devastate the livestock industry, and then they would be eating school children waiting at the bus. Could you talk a little bit about the wolf population in Yellowstone and the way that it has been regulated? It's largely, except for wolves that go out of the park, is regulating depending upon prey. But talk about why that notion of wolves just exploding and never ending in numbers, how Yellowstone refutes that.
Well, tough question, very complex question. I'll try and answer it briefly. But importantly, I'll preface it by saying there are very few unexploited by human wolf populations anywhere in North America. I'm not talking just continental United States, I'm talking Canada and Alaska. The leading cause of mortality for wolves every place in Alaska, Canada, lower 48 is humans. Sometimes it's over 80%, other times it's just above 50. But if you're a wolf, you're likely going to die to a human. And so the important point to answer your question in short is wolf population levels are rarely regulated by natural forces. They're usually regulated by humans. And so the wolf population is usually called your social carrying capacity, not your biological carrying capacity. And maybe I'll just leave it there, but after you get into the biological carrying capacity realm, you get into these sticky arguments about wolves. I'm having them now with prominent wolf biologists. I won't mention their name, but wolves can be self-regulating. Another way of saying that is density dependence. Is they start going up. The early part of their lower densities is largely guided by the available food. It's called extrinsic regulation. And as their population starts to grow, they start to compete with each other and actually kill each other. The leading cause of wolf mortality in Yellowstone is other wolves. It's one of the few places you can find a naturally regulated wolf population. So as they begin to kill each other, that's called density dependence or intrinsic regulation. In other words, they begin to hold the number of wolves below what food can support. They just don't keep increasing at this linear rate that is correlated with biomass or food. It goes up first and then it levels off because wolves start killing each other. And some people call that self-regulation, intrinsic regulation, density dependence, whatever. And they don't like it because as soon as you say self-regulation, that argues against a need for hunting. Okay, they're separate arguments. That doesn't mean, and my arguments tonight were not that wolves should not be hunted. Okay, it's the type hunting, it's the harvest rate, it's how we do it is the issue. But self-regulation doesn't argue against wolf hunting necessarily. And some wolf biologists argue with this because as soon as you say self-regulation, people are going to argue, well, we don't need to hunt them. And that's not what's going on there. Anyways.
Thank you. I want to share a quick anecdote about Grizzly 399 tonight, if it's all right with you. 17 years ago, on a June day, there was a school teacher who went for a walk in Grand Teton National Park, stumbled upon an elk carcass, and was suddenly attacked by a grizzly bear. This grizzly bear felt threatened by the human approaching the carcass, and the bear and her 3 cubs bit the school teacher and was on top of him, and through a series of events survived. Had Grizzly 399 wanted to kill the school teacher, she could have. And she was also teaching a lesson to her cub that day. What was fascinating in these hair-raising events, and they're recounted in the books that I collaborated with Tom Mengelson, is that as the victim was being rushed to Jackson Hole, he pleaded with the medical people to call back and said, "Don't kill the bear, it wasn't her fault." And rangers that day, there was nearly mistaken identity. When she returned to the carcass, some people thought she was back feeding on the human victim. She easily could have been killed. And so calls were made. There were 2 calls made. One was to the Grand Teton Superintendent, Mary Gibson Scott, and another one was to this gentleman right here, Dr. Servheen. And the question was, what should we do about it? And could you explain to them what you said, why, and why do you think Grizzly 399 matters?
Well, in every case in which there's a human injury or a fatality, we discuss what to do with the bear. And if the event is due to what we call natural aggression, like a bear is surprised, a bear is defending a carcass, or a bear is defending her cubs, in almost all of those cases, we leave those bears alone. And that was the case with 399. She was on a carcass. This individual didn't know the carcass was there. He came around a corner, was right on top of her. She jumped him, bit him a couple times, and then left. And it was an easy decision. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was just naturally trying to defend that carcass from that surprised person. And so it was easy to say that she was fine. And we left her alone. And I think the result is that she was on the landscape for up until last night, the day before, well, 2 days ago, I guess, last night, 2 days ago. And, you know, she's been an ambassador for grizzly bears now. She's been very visible. She's the only grizzly bear with a Facebook page that I know of. And 2 books about her, thousands and thousands of photographs. She's probably sold hundreds, if not thousands, of Canon lenses for the Canon Corporation. She shows people that she can be a really good mother, that she can live to really old ages and still be careful with her young. Some people thought she liked being around people. She did not like being around people. The reason that she was down around those roads and close to people is she was trying to stay away from adult males with her cubs, because adult males will kill cubs. And the adult males were in the secure habitat. That meant that she had to go closer to people. And she was temperate and quiet and understanding, trying to get around people. She was nervous around people. She didn't want to be there. But through the good efforts of the Park Service with their bear brigades in Grand Teton National Park and the management agencies, Wyoming Game and Fish and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they did everything they could to keep her alive. And she lived until just a few days ago. And she was an ambassador for bears. And she showed people that bears aren't these demon animals that are out there just sneaking up on people and trying to eat them all the time. She was tolerant of us, probably too tolerant, and we'll miss her. And she was a good ambassador.
Could you just elaborate a little bit on that teaching behavior? You often said over the years that you manage for populations, but in this case, one individual mother, 24 animals descended in her bloodline. Half of them have died in human run-ins with people, various kinds of deadly run-ins. Why was she important? Why do animals like her matter in maintaining a population?
Well, animals have a culture. Bears have a culture. Wolves have a culture. If you define culture as behavior that is transitioned from one generation to another through taught behaviors, and we have our culture, we get that from people that are older than us in the societies we live in. Bears get it from their mother. And she taught her young how to live around people and how to get across roads and what to be careful with. And the fact that she had all those young was the fact that she had a good culture. And by allowing bears with a good culture to live on the landscape, we get more of them. Same thing with wolves, you know. If an animal is in trouble, then we should remove that animal. Depredating, for example, on livestock, we want those animals to be gone because we don't want animals to be depredating on livestock either. But by removing those depredators or bears that have bad behavior or wolves, we end up with animals that are wise, and they teach that to their young, and we have wiser populations. And that's what happens out there on the landscape. And you know, I'll just bring up this Wyoming thing. That wolf that was run down and brought into that bar had never killed any livestock. She was minding her own business, got seen by this guy on a snow machine. He ran her down and killed her. And killing animals just because you can kill them when they're not doing anything wrong, I don't believe in that. That's wrong.
But one more anecdote I'd like to share is that in '75, when states were resistant and the Forest Service was resistant to recovery of bears, and then again when states opposed wolf reintroduction, there is this thing called existence value, and it can be actually converted into economic value in this notion of bears being worth more alive than dead. So the National Park Service does annual surveys on economic activity, and the top 3 attractions to Yellowstone National Park are the geysers, wolves, and grizzly bears. So in recent years of studies, the Park Service estimates for the value of both of those animals. The total value of economic activity generated through nature tourism in Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Park in good years is about $1.5 billion. 2 of the top 3 attractions are grizzly bear watching and wolf watching, and so had it not been for the ESA, these animals would not have been brought back. 15,000 jobs are created related to nature tourism just in Yellowstone and Grand Teton alone. Huge numbers up around Glacier. Doug, I wanted to ask you, what do you think about the debate over relisting wolves? Where do you stand, and what would you do if you could change sort of the management approaches?
Yeah, I'm always afraid of that question because the way I started the talk, you know, I'm over here. And being in that position, you would logically think I'm going to argue for relisting because the states, especially Idaho and Montana, have done a poor job managing wolves. They did what Chris is talking about. They can consider them vermin and creatures like we approached during the 1800s. I'm not going to say that. And the reason I'm not going to say that is because I still have colleagues working in many areas of the government who would argue that that would set wolf recovery back significantly because there's this anti-federal attitude. I mean, you know, you can win elections in Montana being anti-government, for crying out loud. I mean, we have one in 2 weeks, and that's the most solid platform to be on, anti-federal government. And so relisting would cause a backlash, especially in states like Wyoming, where you know you don't even fill the room when you do season-setting regulations anymore about wolves. If they were relisted, it would fire up that whole state against the federal government argument again. And I also, in retirement, have been dealing more directly with some policymakers. And you know, the best form of human interaction is to look someone in the eye and have an honest conversation with them. And you know, some of that, these regulations, these were small incremental wins. You know, that goes out the door if you throw a flamethrower through, you know, to those people. And right now, that's what relisting would be taken as, a flamethrower to all these relationships. And so I have hope, I guess, and trust, and that, you know, by conversations like this, and by the way, the other thing that you hear about is, you know, hey, thanks for the information. We need more knowledge, and I haven't heard much about this from my constituents. Well, every person in this room is a constituent of Montana, and I'm hoping that that process can lead to better wolf and grizzly bear decision-making in Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, through respectful, science-based conversations amidst people of a reasonable nature. Relisting is the flamethrower, and that creates this federal backlash that I know so well, having worked for the federal government, and what people say to us and think about us is you want to try and work from the grassroots organic level. But I will say, if things keep going like they have been, I'm going to jump. And this is, some of my colleagues are on the relisting side. They're upset at me. The states have done a terrible job. Relist them. It's the second thing that Chris talked about, the adequate regulatory mechanism. If you continue to do that, put them back on the list because you don't deserve to manage wolves. So right now, I still have hope in that process.
Thank you.
Todd, let me ask you a question. You've written about urban sprawl and the development of land. Looking at that map and looking at the development that's occurring, what are some solutions, do you think?
Well, let me begin by doing a shout out to Gus O'Keefe, who's back there, Yellowstonian co-founder, and Lori Riker, who co-founded, and I hope Yellowstonian was founded to be a solution, and it's found at yellowstonian.org. Now, apart from that, people often complain about journalists saying that we only identify problems and not solutions. So I would say this, the big question facing all of us is, does wildlife matter? And if you look at the polling out there, 99% of people say that wildlife matters. So the question is, do we want to treat it like it matters or not? So I would say a couple of things. In the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, there are 20 counties. There's just one county with a county-wide plan and enforceable zoning. You can never protect something as spectacular as Greater Yellowstone or the Northern Rockies around us here if you don't have a plan, a cohesive plan for how to protect it. Business people in the audience tonight are watching from home. They all know that you have to have a strategy for how you're going to comport yourself. If we're going to have an ecosystem, we need to think like an ecosystem. And it's really imperative that counties plan throughout Montana and elsewhere. Because the free market approach, voluntary conservation, isn't getting the job done fast enough. Second thing is, since COVID, billions of dollars of real estate, if you think about Bozeman, Big Sky, Teton Valley, Idaho, and Jackson Hole, just since COVID it changed hands. Most of it is from outsiders coming into Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. Polling shows that there's growing resentment. You see it in the political campaigns this year of both Democrats and Republicans complaining about out-of-state interests and people transforming Montana. That's what the polling suggests. It's what all of you believe. So one of the things that's been advanced from people I interview is a real estate transfer tax. A modest 1% tax. Most of the people pouring into the region are people of means who can afford to buy properties. You could have a means test below a certain dollar level of property value. They would be excluded from this. But you could raise conservatively tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars over decades, and you could put that money back into conservation easements to incentivize ranchers and farmers to keep them on the land. You could have money for conflict resolution and reimbursement programs for wolves and make ranchers and farmers happy so they don't view those animals as liabilities. You could pour money back into affordable housing, which is a huge issue in Missoula and Bozeman and every mountain town. You could do lots of things with that money, and we're not taxing the free riders. In Montana, we have this anti-tax mentality, but we're not taking advantage of those visitors. And then the third thing is something that all the hunters and anglers out there, you all pay a tax when you buy hunting gear or fishing gear. There are a couple of taxes, and that goes back to habitat and to supporting state fish and game agencies and the Fish and Wildlife Service. One of the things that's been proposed is that hunter numbers are going down nationally. Whether you like hunting or not doesn't matter, but numbers are declining. And so it's been proposed that there be a backpack tax, if you will, but a tax, modest tax asserted on all outdoor gear, from ski jackets and rain gear to backpacks and tents and all kinds of other things. We've all been excluded from that, but that too would raise tens of millions of dollars. The problem is the outdoor retail industry and product manufacturers are vehemently opposed to that. But people believe that we all should pay our fair share on that, it would generate lots of money that could go back into those very things that are challenging us now. So together, with enough money, that's always the question, we could solve lots of problems, and I think we could probably buy a lot more tolerance on the landscapes. If Fish and Game people didn't feel like they had to fundraise to pay their salaries off of licenses, maybe they would appreciate non-game species a little more. So thanks for the question. Before I go out, and I want to open it up to all of you, I want to ask you a question, Chris. People have said that unless we delist grizzly bears, the ESA is failing. They say that meeting numeric thresholds, it's time to delist. And the assumption is that we delist to hunt. But in the case of the bald eagle, exponentially more bald eagles, you could argue that they would be fine trophies to hunt. Bald eagles and golden eagles kill more domestic livestock than grizzlies and wolves across the country. They're more widely distributed, and yet they're still protected under the Migratory Bird Species Act and the Eagle Act, and they were delisted. So my question is this: what do you think about the idea of declaring victory on the ESA, delisting grizzlies, and simultaneously putting them under the jurisdiction of a new federal law, say the Grizzly Bear Protection Act, in light of the fact that grizzlies are going to face persistent threats, largely due to population pressure and loss of habitat and climate change? What do you think about that?
Well, that's a tough question. I guess, you could have something like a Grizzly Bear Protection Act, similar to the Bald Eagle Protection Act. Bald eagles were delisted, and their mortality is limited because they're under the Bald Eagle Protection Act. You could put something like that in place for grizzly bears, and it might be maybe it's a way to get through the gate of delisting and turning the animals over to state management, but it would limit certain types of mortality. But the majority of the management decisions would be made by the state. And of course, grizzly bears that are in conflicts would still be removed and managed. I mean, there's merit in that. The question is, what can we do to get from either fully list them forever or delist them and hope for the best? Maybe this Grizzly Bear Protection Act approach, similar to bald eagles, is a way that we can try to get there.
Any questions? If you have a question, raise your hand. We'll get the mic over.
Thank you guys for being here tonight. My question to you would be probably to Chris. When a grizzly bear that gets in trouble is relocated, what process is used? Are they moved to another recovery area? Are they put in the same system? Can you explain what happens there, please?
Well, they're usually put in the same recovery area. They're not moved between ecosystems. They're rarely moved between ecosystems at all. They're moved in the same ecosystem. Try to put them back, usually on federal land, to get them away from private land and give them another chance. So every female that's captured is relocated that way.
We have a question here. This is Gus O'Keefe. He's actually with Yellowstonian, and we have a bunch of free posters, grizzly and wolf posters, on your way out. If you'd like to pick one up, they're pretty attractive. Gus?
Well, I appreciate the intro because I'm not a groupie nor a plant. This is actually my own question. So I was at the event in Bozeman, kind of qualifying the not a groupie, and you both talked quite a bit more about your faith in the actual wildlife managers and the biologists working in the states, as opposed to the politicians. If you got to be dictator for a day, because you both are kind of on both sides of the listing and delisting argument, how would you empower them? What would you do to give them the tools to really influence the politicians in a positive way?
Well, I would say that decisions should be made using science and facts. And if you can't make a decision based on science and facts, there shouldn't be a decision. It's that simple. And I think if the biologists are given that freedom to make decisions based on science and facts, we'd get much better wildlife management.
Yeah, I can't add much to that, other than horizontal management instead of vertical management. I think Susan Clark has written the most about this. Include all voices and give power to those voices. I think in the military, they listen to corporals as they listen to everybody up the line. I think right now, mid-level folks, I think don't, at least in my 30-year career, there was a subtle shifting dynamic that, mid-level folks based in the field, voices have been diminished. And I don't have evidence to prove that. That's just a feeling. So in addition to that, which I think can be defended with evidence, I think all voices matter, and decision-making should be more including many voices instead of just command and control. And that's what I think we're referring to about politics becoming more dominant than wildlife biology.
Hi. And Chris, this is probably maybe for you because you might be more familiar with it since you're with FWP. Normally, I buy my fishing license at a local business, and this year I happened to buy it online. And as I'm checking out, there was a pop-up on the FWP website for the fishing license that asked if I would contribute a donation to help with the flights and lethal removal of wolves. I'm pretty disturbed by that, and of course you'd have the option to say yes or no, but I guess my question is, is this something new, do you know? And I mean, a donation for lethal removal, I think that's kind of a little absurd.
Yeah, you said Chris, but the question was about wolves.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not actually familiar with that. When I get a fishing license, I buy it in person at Sportsman's Warehouse, but I can't comment on that. I would not say that's professional wildlife management to ask anglers to fund aerial wolf control, is what you're saying that is. And, that's called predator control. It's done in Canada and Alaska primarily to help woodland caribou and increase moose and, other wildlife populations. It's considered a measure of last resort. Many people consider it repugnant and unethical and it's done for livestock control in Montana. You fly around a helicopter, shoot a wolf outside the helicopter. To use that in everyday standard wildlife management, I personally think is inappropriate. So I would not give money to that, and I might write in or call in and say, I don't, I think that's very good to do, yeah.
This is kind of off topic, and I apologize, but can you tell me what the status is of reintroduction of grizzlies in the North Cascades?
The North Cascades grizzly bear reintroduction is, they completed the EIS process. They're right now trying to get organized with funding and personnel to begin to put bears in there next year. That's what I understand. So the idea is to put a small number of bears in there over the next few years to reintroduce bears in there. There's people down here too. Todd, go ahead.
All right, we'll go here and then I'll head over there.
Hi, I'm actually a seasonal park ranger in Glacier National Park, and I do my talk programs on foxes, coyotes, and wolves. I spoke with Dr. Diane Boyd this summer, and she actually retired recently, and wolves haven't been tracked there since she retired. But when she was employed, she would utilize tags for tracking. And the Grizzlies there, they utilize GPS tracking collars there. And because Yellowstone, unfortunately before, radio telemetry has been negatively used for finding the wolves and hunting the wolves outside the park. Glacier is not conducive for radio telemetry, but Yellowstone is. However, because of that, have there been any talks about going over to a new kind of tracking system like GPS collars instead of telemetry collars in Yellowstone?
Yeah. There is the monitoring of wolves in Yellowstone is transitioning to different methods besides just using radio collars. I think radio collars are still part of the current program, but they're doing, this was something started since I left by people working there, Dan Staler primarily, is working in kind of a bioacoustics artificial intelligence monitoring system where you put devices out that record wolf howls and you can identify individuals based on their howling signature. This is in the experimental phases as far as I know. I'm not up on it, so I'm not really in a position to comment. But, you know, radio collars have always been controversial in national parks because, you know, you work for Glacier. The idea of national parks is to preserve, protect, and leave wildlife alone. And, you know, we're putting these collars on them, but I always defended radio collars because there's a societal need to have information about especially wolves, because wolves have a cultural history that if we don't have data on wolves, people make up the data. They literally have stories and fables. You know, the Three Little Pigs and Little Red Riding Hood has served a societal purpose, is everybody thinks they know what the wolves they live with do. And it's usually wrong. Daniel Kahneman wrote a book on this. You know, it's kind of what Chris has been talking about, a fact-based decision-making process. Humans tend not to do that. We like to make decisions intuitively. Radio collars give you the hard data to make decisions about wolves, and until society comes around with more appropriate management practices, I'll continue to support radio collars, although the Yellowstone Wolf Project is transitioning to other methods. Maybe they're better, I don't know.
Yes, my name is Shelley Fayette, and I'm a Bitterroot Salish. I live on the Flathead Reservation in Arlee, Montana. We have 3 packs of wolves in our immediate area, and we have a lot of grizzlies in both the primitive area and the Mission Mountain Wilderness. So my question to you is, how much, if any, has traditional ecological knowledge of indigenous people played a role in your management repertoire in your past career?
Well, I think it's a conversation. It's a two-way process. I was friends with Dale Becker, who was a tribal wildlife biologist for the Salish Kootenai tribe. And I think, you know, indigenous culture's presence on the land gives them a lot of traditional, spiritual, cultural knowledge that needs to be incorporated into any decision-making process. I would say that it needs to be integrated with other methods as well. And I'm not saying one method is better than the other. I think multiple methods, you know, kind of all the above leads to wisdom, you know, and I think that is something that tribal culture, elders, you know, the most significant part of this for me was when we reintroduced wolves to Yellowstone, a lot of tribal folks came to bless or pray for the wolves. And I had the privilege of taking out some of them, just us two. And so the knowledge and wisdom they imparted on me definitely helped guide me during my career in Yellowstone. And that was integrated with radio collaring data, you know, so exclusivity of one type of way of learning is, I think, bad. So I think integrating the different ways of learning is important. And at least for my career, those experiences and then my continued interactions with tribal, Levi Holt, especially from the Nez Perce tribe, impacted me greatly when I would meet with the Nez Perce. And we made a connection. And that certainly had an influence, at least on my thinking. So I would say very important.
Thanks for speaking, you guys. Very insightful. We've talked about development in valleys. We've talked about climate change. So for bears in particular, wolves obviously have a different dynamic as well. We're losing areas of connectivity. We're losing food sources such as white pine bark, nuts, cutthroat runs, mule deer on decline. Elk seem to be doing great. But in a changing landscape like this, what is kind of the number and distribution of bears you see as recovered? And do you see there being any type of, given the same way black bears are managed with quotas and once and waste laws where you have to harvest the animal, do you see a place for hunting of grizzly bears if they meet that desired distribution and number, and what would that be?
Okay, in terms of the number, if you look at the that map I showed you of all those populations together in the Northern Rockies, I think if we had those areas fully occupied, we'd be around 3,000, 3,300 grizzly bears. And in terms of harvest rates, did you ask, your question, was that about harvest?
Would there be a place for human hunting given responsible management like black bears are managed with once and waste laws?
Yes, I think there's a possibility to hunt grizzly bears in a sustainable way. It would always be a very low number, and it would be carefully regulated in some areas. And, some taken from here and some taken from there, and it might be a zonal management like Doug talked about. But yeah, hunting could be possible in the future management of grizzly bears, because you can hunt grizzly bears and still have sustainable hunts and healthy populations. But it's important to recognize, and I'm a hunter, that a lot of people have a lot of emotional feelings about hunting. The issue of hunting was probably the single most hot button issue related to delisting. Because when the states talked about hunting, the emotions just went through the roof. And that previous question about tribes, I went around, I was still working at that time in 2016. I went to all the tribal councils that you saw on that map up there and asked about, what do the tribes think about delisting grizzly bears and what's their view of the future of grizzly bears? And they were eloquent and unanimous in their statements that they were opposed to hunting grizzly bears. And they thought that was wrong to be killing such an animal for sport. And particularly since the animals are not eaten. They're rarely, if ever, eaten. And so they were opposed to that. And I respected them and their views on that. But it's important to recognize that that hunting issue is such a hot button issue.
That's why I mentioned the once and waste law in addition.
I'm sorry, I didn't.
Once and waste law, he mentioned.
Yeah, if you were going to hunt a grizzly bear, you should take the meat out. Problem with grizzly bears is they can be heavily infested with parasites and not very palatable, and you wouldn't want to eat it unless you really cooked it very intensively. So, people don't hunt grizzly bears to eat them for the most part. They hunt them for a trophy.
I'm just interested on hearing y'all's opinion on.
Could you speak up a little bit, please?
Yes, I'm just interested in any of y'all's opinions on the permanent protection of a grizzly bear or a wolf. We see how the Wild Horse and Burro Act is. It puts land managers like the BLM in sticky situations, and then also the Marine Protection Act also prevents certain Alaskan natives of hunting marine mammals. And I'm just wondering, could that backfire if that would happen with grizzly bears or wolves?
Yeah, I think it could backfire. I haven't given much thought to that, the idea of having such an act like that. It was, Todd brought the question up, but boy, I don't know, there'd have to be a lot of stuff worked out like that. A lot of details that would have to be considered, and the positives and the negatives. I think it would take a lot of work to build something like that, but I don't think there's been a lot of work done that I'm aware of. So I can't really answer it in an educated way about the details.
Hey, Chris, as I go over to the other question, could you talk a little bit about the percentage of Yellowstone bears when they were delisted and when you first came on as recovery coordinator? I remember you saying that you thought there was a good chance we would lose the bear from the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Could you talk about that challenge with food habituated bears and the challenges?
Okay, I'm going to try to do it briefly. When I started in 1981 as the recovery coordinator, we found that we had about 30 female grizzly bears in the Yellowstone ecosystem. That's it. And almost all the bears were in the park. And it was very likely that we were going to lose grizzly bears. And I had to go back to Washington, D.C. and brief a bunch of people in the Department of Interior and tell them that it's very likely that we're going to lose grizzly bears because we're not getting a lot of cooperation from the various entities. I go talk to the Forest Service and they said, we don't do wildlife management. You got to talk to Fish and Game. And Fish and Game was mad about grizzly bears being listed at that point. And they said, you know, they would sit there like this when I went and talked to them, and they were not very cooperative at all. The Park Service was real positive, but they didn't want to talk about anything outside the park. And so we had a crisis situation. So in 1982, we were on the verge of losing grizzly bears in the Yellowstone system. There were no grizzly bears in the Jackson Valley, no grizzly bears in Grand Teton National Park. And at that point, we had to get the agencies to cooperate together. And on top of that, we had a lot of time that the Park Service was feeding garbage to bears in Yellowstone Park and the outside communities, because like West Yellowstone, Gardner, Cook City, they all had dumps, open dumps around their communities, as well as dumps inside the park. All that garbage was making the bears food conditioned to eating garbage. And so we had all these bears that died because they closed the dumps in 1967. The numbers of deaths each year were probably in the 70 to 90 each year, 90 range each year that we knew about. Population was very low, and we worried that maybe we would never get through that time period, and all the bears being food conditioned to garbage would just all die and get into trouble. And somehow we got through that. There were bears in there that learned to not eat, to eat natural foods, and we got all the agencies to cooperate together through the efforts of the agencies. Imagine in 1983, we got the 4 governors of the states of Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, and Washington to sign a memorandum of agreement to implement the grizzly bear recovery plan. Do you think we'd get that done today? It was an amazing time, and we came through it. And now we've got about 1,100 grizzly bears in the Yellowstone ecosystem. So we've come a long way, and it was all through the efforts of the Endangered Species Act and cooperation among all the agencies.
Doug, this is a question for you. Do you know much about how the wolf reintroduction to Colorado is going? I know they reintroduced wolves last December, but what's their future plan with their wolves?
I mean, to restore the population like Yellowstone, they're modeling it after Yellowstone, and I think it's going well, but some people would not agree with me. They reintroduced 10 wolves at the end of last year, and 2 of them had pups, but they preyed on livestock after they had the pups, so they removed them and put them in captivity, multi-acre enclosure, and in the process of doing that, the adult male died. So they've got the female and pups in captivity, trying to decide what to do. The other wolves didn't pair up or form packs, and the best I can tell, I'm in loose touch with those folks, not great touch. Those individual wolves are doing fine, and I think they plan another year of reintroductions. They've had some trouble getting wolves because it's the game of political football that we've been talking about all night. You know, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming don't want to give them state wolves. So they're, I've heard, going to Canada to get them. There's some discussion about that because they've had some livestock depredations. But I think if you take the long view, none of what I just said is unexpected. When you have a population, when you move wolves around, there's going to be a certain percentage of wolves that get into trouble, and you got to get through those low population years to build the population up. And the reason for that, it gives you more flexibility in making management decisions. that pack that had the pups they were, I don't know if this is the right way to put it, but to make a point, they were chronic depredators, and usually chronic depredators are removed. But when your population's very low and they're reproducing, that's hard to do. When you have a larger population, that's easier to do. So I think they need to get through this difficult period of low population where everything that happens becomes a critical decision, and that's achieved by, I think, more reintroductions. They, by the way, call it introductions in some politicians. Wolves were there, they were eradicated, and bringing them back is called a reintroduction. But some people who don't like wolves have these subtle word games of introduction. But in a nutshell, I think everything's on course, and these are expected problems. You just need to confront them and deal with them.
So this is another question for Doug. So I feel like, as I've seen a lot, is that one of the major things for any wolf reintroduction in any state is talking with ranchers and farmers about how they can coexist with wolves. During your line of work, how hard has it been to talk and speak with ranchers, and have you swayed any ranchers into changing their views on wolves?
Yeah, you're striking at the heart of the matter here. The short answer, because I am bad at answering questions because I go too long. So the short answer is it depends on crowd size. Every rancher I've met is salt of the earth, great person. Get him in a room full of people like this, they want to slit your throat. So it's kind of, the crowd size thing. When you talk to them one-on-one, that is the best form of communication, and you can make some progress. And that's laborious and time-consuming and hard to do, but I've never met a rancher, there's been maybe a few, but most are polite, respectful, love the land, love wildlife. Usually it stops short at wolves. All you got to do is talk to them. They're not that bad. In fact, I try and always avoid sound bites. That's my favorite sound bite about wolves. They're not that bad. And so if you can look a rancher in the eye and have that conversation, it can go okay. But it seems in this day and age, we're going like this. And so some of those ranchers are drifting, they're hardening those views, but the best way is one-on-one.
My question is for you, Doug. As the media continues to villainize wolves and as we see these less protections for the species, how can we work for true science communication or enhancing true science communication with the general public?
Okay, this is the difficult question part of the evening. Relationships, my favorite expression in life is about relationships and experiences, and apply that thinking to science education. I think that, I'm very worried about the future of the world, and one of the best ways to solve it is through communication, which is the relationship side of that phrase I just gave you. And, the other side of that too is people nowadays crave authenticity. They say that's what wins elections. So have honest, heartfelt conversations with people from every walk of life. I didn't get to this part of my slide presentation because I was off on a lot of things. But one of the old-time legendary rangers in Yellowstone came up to me one time and said, "You're doing a terrible job. Your scientific publications, your interviews, your books mean nothing. You need to go into the mountains on horseback and talk to the people who hunt elk for a living. They're called outfitters. You need to talk to them directly." And I did 3 trips with him starting in 2000, and then he passed away, and I continued those trips. And when I retired, some people said that was the single best thing I did in my career, was to take the message to them, not have them come to my office as a bureaucrat, but go into their camps and talk to them. And that is critical. That's science communication, although I had to learn to listen more than I talked. That was hard for me. But it was also talking to someone who did not think and believe as I did. And that, like I said, every gain that we've gotten with wolf management recently was incremental. That was incremental gain as well. You look like the type of person that can do that. I encourage you to think about doing that.
Before you all leave, I just want to thank you for coming out. And I have one final question for our esteemed experts here. But again, thank you for coming out. This is where the dialogue needs to happen, and you all matter. Doug and Chris, you're here because you're concerned about what remains of the wild northern Rockies. You're speaking out. What is it that most concerns you, and what would you recommend for people here tonight and watching in? What do we need to do? What do we need to be paying attention to?
Well, this all started and ends with voting. And, you know, the reason we're in this deep trouble right now is because of voting and the people that got voted in. And so we urge everybody to vote. Vote, think about natural resources, think about wild things, think about keeping Montana the last best place, and vote, and get everybody you know to vote.
I'll just add one little twist to that. Your voice matters. You can vote and use your voice. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you.